Happy Thursday and welcome back to Locked On Red Sox podcast. Thank you so much for making Locked On Red Sox your first listen every single day. I'm your host, Massachusetts Pirates team insider Jake Ignazuski, and I'll also be joined by my co-host, NESN writer Lauren Campbell. Lauren and I had the opportunity to interview Red Sox beat writer for the Boston Globe, Peter Abraham, and get his thoughts on what his mindset was going into this year's voting of the Hall of Fame and what his reaction was to the results that came out yesterday. So let's listen to our conversation with Peter Abraham.
You are Locked On Red Sox, your daily Boston Red Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are here with Red Sox beat writer for the Boston Globe, Peter Abraham. How are we doing today, Peter?
I'm good, guys. How are you?
Hanging in there with no baseball.
How has it been for you, coming up with ideas, especially not only during this offseason, but during this lockout?
Yeah, well, it kind of feels like when the pandemic hit, we were kind of scrambling around, looking for stuff to write about, not having access to people. But at least during the pandemic, we could actually talk to executives about players and to players about what was going on. And during the lockout, both sides seem to have been, told not to talk to the media. So there's been very little communication, which is frustrating. But thanks to our old pal, David Ortiz, we've had a lot to write about lately. So that's been good.
Yeah, I was going to ask if the Hall of Fame ballots and the Hall of Fame selection, it's almost like a relief because all of a sudden you went from what can I write about today to, oh my God, I have all these stories to write and I have a deadline to make.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to read about the lockout. It's sort of like taking your vitamins. Like you have to learn about it and you have to know about it, but it's not really anything that's all that fun. But the Hall of Fame is fun. Debating about the Hall of Fame is fun, and everybody has an opinion about the Hall of Fame. I mean, my mom, who's 82 years old, has a big opinion about the Hall of Fame. She couldn't wait to talk about it this morning. So it's a fun thing. It drives readership. It's good for the Globe. It's good for baseball. It's good for the Red Sox. It's good for everybody. So, this last week or so, preparing for the Hall announcement and writing about it has been a lot of fun. A lot of good memories about covering David. I think it's interesting to see what's happening with the ballot now and what's going to happen next year. So, especially the last 72 hours have been great.
I bet. And were you surprised by the results last night, or were they kind of expected?
No, I mean, with the ballot tracking now, so, you can follow all the public ballots leading up to the announcement. You kind of had a sense of what was going to happen. I thought that David got in a little, I thought it was going to be really close. I thought it was going to be within 5 votes either way, because that's the way it looked. So I thought he had a more comfortable margin than I thought he was going to have. It's great for him that he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. It's a cool thing. It's a great honor, especially for the people in the Dominican Republic who are obviously super excited about having their fourth guy in the Hall of Fame. I was a little surprised that he got in as easily as he did. It wasn't that tight. But I think it also speaks to how the ballot has changed and how the electorate has changed. A lot more younger writers now, a lot of writers from more diverse backgrounds. I think you're seeing the BBWA change, and with it, as people get eligible to vote, the people voting have changed too, and that's been really good, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that even just the past 5 years or so, you've seen a lot of changes in how people vote. A lot more talk about the character clause, I believe, is coming each and every year. And you've been voting now for some time, and you make your ballot public every year. But take us through, like, what is your mindset when you finally get that ballot? Like, what's your mindset? Do you kind of have an idea already who you're going to vote for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, who's going to be on the ballot. And I'm actually on the BBWA committee that puts the ballot together. We look at all of the people who are eligible for it. And, I think there's 5 of us. And we vote on who we think should, move on to the actual ballot. So, I have a really good sense of who's going to be on it. And I kind of approach it every year by, I want to be consistent. I want to vote for the same people that I voted for in the past, assuming that they're still on the ballot, unless there's some really compelling reason not to do that. And I want to give all of the new candidates a full vetting, and sit down and look at their numbers and compare them to other players and ask people I know and trust around the game what they think. So to some degree, I was preparing for that during the season last year, talking to people about, guys who you knew were going to be on the ballot for the first time. And, as a baseball fan, before I was a baseball writer, it's fun to do that, look back at guys' careers and remember, big moments in their careers and things like that. And then the thing that's kind of charming about the Baseball Hall of Fame ballot is it's an actual 8x10 piece of paper. It comes in the mail, and you mark it with a pen and you fold it back up and put it in an envelope and you mail it. And like, how many things in your life these days do you mail back to somebody? Like,
right.
It's one of the few times of the year I actually go to the post office because I want to, I don't just want to leave it like in the mailbox somewhere. I want to like actually hand it to somebody to make sure it goes to Cooperstown. So, it's a bit of a throwback. I'm assuming eventually someday it'll be an online form, but for now it's kind of having it on your desk and looking at it and checking off names is kind of cool.
That's pretty cool. I didn't even know that, because I mean, obviously you would just expect they would email it to you and you just like click in the little X's and then do like the electric signature at the end. But yeah, that's pretty cool how they still do it old fashioned like that. Yeah,
it's funny. The Hall of Fame is a throwback in a lot of ways, and that's one of them.
That's awesome. And obviously one debate that has just been circulating the internet throughout after the results last night is the Bonds and Clemens debate. And I'm curious if you were surprised that they didn't make it in during their final last year on the ballot.
No, the way the numbers were trending, it didn't look like they were going to get in. They hit the highest number that they've had in their time on the ballot. But a few years ago, when the Hall of Fame decided that candidates would only be on the ballot for 10 years and not 15 years, I think that was kind of the death knell for Bonds and Clemens, that they weren't going to have the time for the electorate to keep changing, to get younger, to get more willing to, look at the steroid era as something that happened in baseball. I think had it gone 15 years, they would have got in. But with 10, it wasn't going to happen. So I've always been a Bonds and Clemens voter. I've always looked at it like the steroid era happened. You can't pretend it didn't happen. The Hall of Fame has Bud Selig and Joe Torre and Bobby Cox and Tony La Russa. They were all, sort of key figures of the steroid era. Why wouldn't there be any players? So that's how I've looked at it. Now, I also look at it like you have to look at it in the context of the time, and that a lot of home runs or a lot of doubles or great numbers are different than what they are now and what they were before steroids. So I vote for Bonds and Clemens. I don't vote for Gary Sheffield. So like, I think you have to look at it like, offense came really cheap during that time because, everybody was, not everybody, but a lot of hitters were using steroids. So it's a tricky thing. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I respect anybody who doesn't want to vote for them. I don't know that there's a way you can say, I feel completely right about this. And it's kind of weird. Like, as somebody who voted for them, I would have been perfectly fine with them getting in. But I'm not broken up that they're not in. I think to some degree they decided what they were going to do, and they're being punished for it. But at the same time, I voted for David, and I feel great that David got in because it's a happy thing. And so it's sort of strange, the Bonds and Clemens thing, and the Schilling too. I vote for Schilling because I feel like I should, but I don't know that I would have been all that happy if he had gotten in. So it's kind of a strange thing.
It is, and it's, you mentioned earlier like how you want to vote with consistency, and I feel like the Hall of Fame, it's if this person is in, why isn't this person, or right. And vice versa. And I feel like Bonds and Clemens, they're always going to be a debate. You mentioned the steroid era. That's the era I grew up in. It's what, like, my first memories of baseball are watching Mark McGwire with no neck, just belting home runs. And it's just like that. Barry Bonds is still one of the greatest hitters in MLB. Roger Clemens, he's a 7-time Cy Young Award winner. Like, no one has done that. No one's done what either of them have done. And it is a shame that it's an error that happened in baseball. And like you said, Bud Selig, Joe Torre are in the Hall of Fame. Where's the consistency there? And Schilling, of course, is another very polarizing, interesting character on that ballot. He, like you mentioned, did not make it in last year. He went on Facebook and said he wanted to be taken off the ballot. Do you think that changed other voters' opinions, maybe not to vote for him?
Yeah, I mean, he gave everybody an out, basically, is what happened. He had 71.1% of the votes last year, which strongly suggests that he would have gotten in this year if he had never opened up his laptop, because guys who are in their final year on the ballot almost always get a bump. And if he had just not said anything and said, well, wait for next year, he'd be in the Hall of Fame today. But immediately after the voting was announced, he unleashes this 1,200 word, manifesto, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, on Facebook, and says that every voter is corrupt and we're all moral degenerates and we're all terrible people. This is after 71% of us voted for him, but we're all bad, really bad people. And then he announces, well, I don't want to be on the ballot and this is a terrible thing. And I'm calling on the Hall of Fame to take me off the ballot. Well, the Hall of Fame, of course, didn't take him off the ballot because the player has no say on who's on the ballot. And I think what he did in a crowded ballot, and with, some people didn't want to vote, wanted to vote for 10. I voted for 7. I think in a crowded ballot, a lot of people said, well, Curt Schilling doesn't want to be on the ballot. I won't vote for him. And he lost, I think it was 15 or 17 votes from people who voted for him last year. And that was of his own doing. I mean, he'd be in the Hall of Fame, I think he would have been in the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago if he had not done and said some of the things he did. But again, it's his choice. He's the one who said them, and he's going to have to live with what happened. And he made a comment last year that I think he feels like he'll sail through the Veterans Committee. And I just don't think that's true. I think the people who are the Hall of Famers are on the Veterans Committee. There's people, baseball historians and veteran writers. It's a 16-member committee. If you're them and they're in a room and there's no, those votes aren't announced, it's all private. They're in a room debating the candidates. How many of those people are going to say, yes, we want Curt Schilling to be at a microphone in Cooperstown in July talking in front of 50,000 people? I don't know that a lot of those guys are going to say, yeah, that sounds like a hell of an idea. I just wonder if that's going to happen. So what happens with Curt is going to be not dissimilar what happens with Clemens and Bonds. They're kind of following on the same track, but for different reasons. It'll be interesting to see if any of them ever get in the Hall of Fame.
Do you ever take something like what Curt Schilling said when he said, voters are corrupt and everything? Do you ever take that personally? Because you are someone who also covered Curt Schilling as well.
Yeah, I didn't, I covered him sort of when I was covering other teams and they would play the Red Sox. I never covered Curt when he was playing for the Red Sox. I got to know him a little bit, and I would ask him questions about pitching, and he was a great guy to talk to about pitching. He's a really smart guy when it comes to baseball. And I didn't, I'm still not clear what happened to him, why he, became so, the comments that he made and everything. But no, I wasn't offended because I don't know. I'm not corrupt. I make my ballot public. I try to be consistent with it. If anybody, I don't know where you would say that a writer is corrupt. I mean, maybe should I be getting a payment from Bonds because I voted? Like, I don't know. I don't understand what he means by that. But he's a very angry guy. He's very angry about the media in general. I think he lumps us in with political reporters he doesn't like for whatever reason. I don't know. I mean, he lied a few years ago and said that I had stopped voting for him, which I hadn't. So I sent him a link to the BBWA website with our voting records, and he blocked me on Twitter. So apparently, I don't know.
Wow.
Proving that I had voted for him made him angry. It seems like a strange thing. Yeah, I voted for you, Curt, and okay, you're blocked. So I don't know. It's hard to, he's a hard guy to figure out. But he was a hell of a pitcher. I mean, I think he belongs in the Hall of Fame. So.
Yep, definitely.
I hope you guys are enjoying our conversation with Peter Abraham so far, but Lauren just wants to take a second real quick to talk to you about Built Bar.
You know me by now. You know how much I absolutely love Built Bar. And now that it's the new year, that means some New Year's resolutions are starting to kick in. And if yours is about getting fit, maybe eating a little bit healthier, make sure you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is the best protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. Doesn't have that chalkiness, maybe that cardboard taste that some other protein bars have. And it makes it easy to stick to your resolution because it tastes so good, you will want to eat it, unlike those other protein bars, like I said, that can be a little chalky, a little cardboardy, maybe even a little waxy. It's just not good. Built Bar is not like that at all. There are so many flavors to choose from. There's raspberry, double chocolate, mint chocolate, and my favorite, cookies and cream. And Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. So by week 3 of your resolution, when eating healthy is getting a little bit tricky, you kind of thinking, where's the chocolate? Built Bar. Built Bar is where the chocolate is at. And we have an offer for you. Go to built.com, use offer code LOCKED15 for 15% off your order. That's LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com.
I mean, like I said to Lauren during our reaction yesterday, I find it interesting that his bloody stock is in the Hall of Fame, but his actual plaque isn't in the Hall of Fame. But everybody makes choices in life, and the choices are what ultimately come to the conclusion. But Lauren and I were also debating on whether Bonds or Clemens could potentially get over the hump with the Veterans Committee voting in a little bit. Do you think that could potentially happen?
I'm writing about that actually for the paper tomorrow, and I don't know. I mean, it's interesting now. There used to be one Veterans Committee, and it met every year. Now there's 4 Veterans Committees, and they meet sporadically. There's one group that meets twice every 5 years. Others meet less frequently because they're looking at players from years gone by. So coincidentally, the group, the what they call the Today's Game Committee, is meeting in December, and in theory, they could put Roger and Barry on that ballot. They would be eligible to be on that ballot. So would Kurt. And I don't think that they'll put them on right away. I think they'll let it kind of get some air for a while, let things cool down. There's other people, whether it's Fred McGriff or Jim Leland, or there's other people who I think people would be happy to see them get in the Hall of Fame. There wouldn't be any controversy. I think they might address those guys first, and then in a couple of years get to Bonds and Clemens. So I don't think it's going to be a quick ride through the Veterans Committee. And the other thing I think a lot of people don't understand is, who doesn't want anybody in the Hall of Fame? Guys in the Hall of Fame. Like Joe Morgan sent a letter to all of us a few years ago saying nobody who uses steroids should be in the Hall of Fame. And there's a lot of players. Ozzie Smith has said that. There's a number of guys who have said, we're against the idea of having anybody connected to steroids in the Hall of Fame. And these committees, have 4 or 5 members of the Hall of Fame. So if you're in a room as a voter and whether a Hall of Fame player stands up and says, I feel very strongly that, this player shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, that's a hard one to go against, I would think, if you're one of the historians or journalists in that room. So I think it's going to be a long, hard road for Bonds and Clemens to get in. Now, maybe if, like the electorate, members of the Hall of Fame are getting younger, and maybe some of those guys who played with Bonds and Clemens will say, well, I think it'd be okay if they were in. It was a wild time, the steroid era or whatever. But that's going to take a while because most of the Hall of Famers are guys in their 60s and 70s.
Yeah, like you said, it could be a long road for both of them. Hopefully, whether it's this year or next year or 10 years down the road, we do see them in the Hall of Fame. I feel like you can't really tell the story and the history of baseball without Bonds, Clemens, and even Schilling. You're one of the many voters who make your ballot public. And I love when people do this because I just love being able to kind of get inside writers' minds and see how they vote, if there's consistency. There were some blank ballots. And for me, I know I'm not a voter by any means. I don't have a vote, but I feel like they're just going to waste if you're not going to use your ballot, use your voice to kind of dictate one way or the other who you do or do not want to see in the Hall of Fame. Do you have any opinion on people who do not vote?
Yeah, well, there's sort of 2 things. You can not vote. You can just not send in your ballot, and if you do that, it doesn't count against the percentages when they're determining who's going to get in the Hall of Fame. Or you can submit a blank ballot. You can mail that ballot in blank, which does count against the percentages. So there were 6 people who sent in blank ballots, and basically for every blank ballot, you're voting against everybody on the ballot when you do that. You're saying, I don't think anybody gets in. By sending this in blank, I'm going to make it harder for them to get in. Now, if you legitimately look at the ballot and you say, I don't think anybody on this ballot belongs in the Hall of Fame, if I ever got to that point, for some reason, I don't think I would send in a blank ballot. I wouldn't try to screw the guys who are on the ballot. I would just not submit a ballot and I would write about it and say, like, I feel like anybody should be in the Hall of Fame this year. When you send in the blank ballot, you're basically, subtracting from the voters who wanted to vote for somebody and making it harder for their candidates to get in. I personally wouldn't do that. It's a legitimate thing to do. It's the Hall of Fame lets you do it. So I wouldn't do it, but I if somebody wanted to, I would support their right to do that.
Yeah, it's a tough debate. When I first saw a few of them come through, I'm just like, why do you even just allow somebody else who actually vote? But I actually didn't know that if you actually send it in, it will actually go against, which just makes me even more annoyed.
Yeah, I mean, it's not it's not out of the realm of possibility that you could get a ballot and say, I don't think anybody on this ballot belongs in the Hall of Fame. That's not inconceivable that it could happen. And I mean, I personally wouldn't have been able to do it this year. But if you said, well, I'm not going to vote for any steroid guys, I don't like Kurt Schilling because of what he said, and I'm not I don't think, say Todd Helton and Scott Rowland are guys that I want in the Hall of Fame. You could probably talk yourself into submitting a blank ballot, I guess. I mean, I wouldn't, but I guess I can see where somebody could maybe get to that point. So it's one of those things, back in the, when the Hall of Fame first started, like the writers were cranks. Like they didn't want anybody to get in, and blank ballots were kind of like a common thing. So it's kind of a holdover from that era.
That's interesting. And we saw Scott Rowland get around, what was it, 63.2?
Yeah, he's getting
Do you see anybody? You think so? So is there anybody out there than Scott Rowland? You brought up like Todd Helton as well. Do you see some of those guys getting in next year as well?
I don't know about next year, but both of those guys are on the track where eventually they're getting in. Usually when you get over 50%, at one way or another, you're going to get in eventually. And I mean, barring, guys like Ponds and Clemens and Schilling. And Rowland is one of those guys. If you take your time and you look at his numbers and you look at the defense and you look at the fact that third base is a very underrepresented position in the Hall of Fame, to me, he's a pretty easy choice. And Todd Helton, it's interesting. The Red Sox were in Colorado a few years ago when Todd Helton played his last home game, and there was big tribute to Todd Helton and the whole thing. And I knew Todd Helton was a good player. I was aware of what a good player he was. I had seen him in All-Star games. But when you're at Coors Field and you're seeing the entire place, paying tribute to this guy, and you realize how much he means to Denver and how much he means to that fan base, which is a really good fan base. I mean, they draw huge crowds. And I was thinking, like, wow, when this guy gets on the ballot, like I kind of thought, well, maybe he's a Hall of Famer. I don't know. But then when I started looking at his numbers, I'm like, wow, this guy's been a really, really good player for a long time. And a lot of people will say, well, he played at Coors Field. Okay, right. And that does elevate your numbers. But he was drafted by the Rockies. And so are you supposed to say, well, I don't want to sign with you because 20 years from now I won't be able to get in the Hall of Fame? I mean, he did what he was supposed to do. He signed with the team. He was a hell of a player. He put up big numbers. I don't think you can hold it against him that he played for a certain team. So, yeah, I very happily voted for him when he got on the ballot.
Have there been other players like that where you kind of see them in their element, whether they're being honored or just seeing them play, that made you kind of be like, oh, yeah, like maybe they do belong in the Hall of Fame. Maybe they should get my vote.
Yeah, that part of it's interesting because, a lot of times you can make a spreadsheet and look at the numbers and compare players to guys in the Hall of Fame, compare players against those in their era, and have a really good sense statistically about what does this guy mean? How good is this guy compared to, another third baseman? But I also think you need to kind of consider what is a guy's place in baseball history. And like, if you look at David, I mean, he was a key figure in the Red Sox breaking this 86-year drought of never having won a championship. And it's the Hall of Fame. I mean, who's more famous in the 21st century in baseball than David Ortiz? Like, I don't think there's anybody. And Mariano Rivera, is sort of a strange guy to have been the first unanimous Hall of Famer. Like, you'd think you would have thought it would have been, Ken Griffey Jr. or somebody. But how could you not vote for Mariano Rivera? And so because you understand it's more than just the numbers. He was just, the best reliever there ever was. He put a team on his shoulders for all of these championships. He had this one pitch that was completely unhittable. Who's more famous than Mariano Rivera as a reliever? So I think there have to be, I don't know if emotional is the way to say it, but there have to be non-statistical factors, I think, when you look at players and try to figure out, like, well, what does this guy mean to baseball? And it's more than home runs or RBIs or saves or whatever. And there's certain guys I think who fall into that category. And I've had a few of my friends who are also writers tell me to take a really good look at Jimmy Rollins and what he means to the Philadelphia Phillies and what he means in that town and what he meant for their championship team, and to kind of reconsider having not voted for him. And I will do that. I don't know that I'll vote for him, but I'll kind of consider that aspect of it and talk to people. So I do think it's important that you can't just run the numbers into a spreadsheet and say, okay, well, him, and him. I think you have to think about it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah,
and those are fun. Agree. It's fun to do that, really. I mean, it's,
Right. Well, also like the impact that they had, like you said, on like the city, the team, and everything like that. I think that is a huge impact in them actually getting in as well. And I I was watching the Boston Globe video where all the writers sort of explained why they voted for certain things and what their mindset was going into it. And I found it fascinating that the story that you told about Johnny Damon coming up to you and asking you if you thought he was a Hall of Famer or not. You don't gotta name any names, but it just made me think. I never knew that players did that. So has anybody else done that?
Well, there might have been a few drinks involved before that happened.
Okay.
I won't sign anything attesting to that, but Johnny. I mean, I've known Johnny for a long time. I covered him when he was in New York, and he's a really good guy, and he's a funny guy. And you guys can look it up. If you look at doubles, triples, home runs, stolen bases, runs scored, and hits, if you look at where Johnny is, he's the only guy with those numbers in the history of baseball. Like that number of doubles, that number of home runs, that number of stolen bases, whatever it is. Now that doesn't put him in the Hall of Fame, but it's he's a lot better player than I think people remember that he was. He was a 2-time world champion. He was a really good defensive player. So Johnny's an interesting guy. And we were at this function, and he just came over. He goes, "What do you think about me as a Hall of Famer?" And I was like, "I don't know. What do you think?" And he was like, "Well, boom, 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 boom." And I was kind of laughing, and then when he actually got on the ballot, I remember going back to that conversation and looking at all of his numbers and going, "Man, I love you, Johnny, but I don't think I can afford the Hall of Fame." But there's another part of it too, which is I think it kind of sucks. Like if you have 10 guys you want to vote for, that's great. There's been a lot of times I've had 6 or 7. I feel like it would be okay if you really not like the guy, but if you felt like, hey, I'm going to throw this guy a vote because I think he was a really good player. I understand he's not a Hall of Famer, but man, he was an awesome player. I'm going to give this guy a vote. But if you did that now, you'd be crushed on Twitter. You'd be crushed everywhere. Everybody, you're making a disgrace of the whole thing. So I mean, I guess you don't want to do that because you don't want to, sort of make the BBWA look bad. But I don't think there would be anything wrong with saying, hey man, Jake Peavy was a great dude. I'm going to give Jake Peavy a vote. Like, how's that going to change anything? It's not going to change anything. So, but it's it's fun to get the ballot because I remember interactions with certain guys, and it's fun to remember having covered some of those guys.
It's fun too to kind of see that personality side of a player. You only see so much personality from games, post-game interviews, pre-game interviews, whatever it is. So even though you said there were maybe a few drinks involved, it's still funny to see just kind of that interaction between media and player.
Yeah, when the Sox won in when Jake Peavy was with the Sox when they won the championship, I was at Fenway Park super late, writing stories for the website and everything, and I came out of gate D. It must have been, I don't know, like 3:30 in the morning. And there's Jake, like on the sidewalk with his brother and a bunch of guys. Like, and he was smoking a cigarette and drinking a Miller Lite, and he had a sleeveless T-shirt on, and it was really cold. And I was like, Jake, what are you doing? Like, put on a jacket, And I ended up I met his brother and met a few people, and hung out there in the corner for a while. And Jake's a really good guy, and every time I run across him, he's like, remember the time I was really drunk after the World Series? And so, and he was on the ballot this year, and I was like, man, Jake Peavy, he's a good dude. So it's fun over the years getting to meet guys and talk to them. And I mean, baseball is a weird thing because, you go to spring training, and if a team gets to the World Series, you're around a guy for like 10 months, and you see them more than you see members of your family. Like, you go to these places, and, we don't travel with them, but, everybody's traveling to these different places, and, you're sitting through rainouts, or one day it's 100 degrees, or, one night the game goes 5 hours, whatever it is. You have these sort of shared experiences. So it's, I don't think it's like football where you don't, there's probably players you go the whole year without talking to. In baseball, you're kind of, you're around the same group of guys for a long, long time, especially if it's a good team. So it's, as much as you want, you're objective and you write what you have to write, you still get to know guys on a personal level.
Hope you guys are enjoying our conversation so far with Peter Abraham. I just want to take a second to talk to you about BetOnline. BetOnline would like to wish you a happy new betting year as we continue our march to the playoffs and beyond. BetOnline remains the number one spot for all the best sports wagering action for 2022. New year and a new updated desktop and mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% off welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code Locked On to get started. From football, basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for 2022. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. Yeah, I just was picturing your description of Jake Peavy, and I've watched him throughout my childhood, and I can't stop laughing about that.
Peave's the best. He's hilarious.
But you talking about interactions with players and that sort of stuff. I'm curious. Obviously David Ortiz was always so nice to the media and was always very comical with the media. I was curious, what's one of your favorite moments outside of interviewing David with him interacting with him?
Well, one of my favorite ones is actually involved interviewing him. We were in Tampa Bay. I can't remember what year it was. And he got into a thing with Chris Archer. Archer threw at him and he got out of the way. And there was sort of this, in-game feud with Chris Archer. And after the game, David was really mad. And so we go to David's locker and he's like, yeah, that Chris Archer, I don't know what he thinks he's doing. He hasn't been in the game for that long. And then my buddy who covers the Tampa Bay, the Rays for the Tampa Bay Times texted me. And he said, Archer said, David, David's a punk. And I had my phone and I said, Archer just said, you're a punk. And he's like, yeah, well, Archer has, Archer's, whatever. And they were going back and forth between me and the other writer, like telling them what they were saying. So the next day, David comes up to me and he goes, how'd you know what Archer was saying? And I'm like, well, the other writer was texting me. And he goes, you guys are just trying to get me in trouble. And I'm like, yeah, kind of. Yes. So he was laughing. And he goes, does Archer know that? And I'm like, I don't know. So, he was kind of laughing that, I was like instigating him by getting text messages from the other writer. But David was a character. Like there was a lot of interesting stuff that happened with him over the years. He didn't like, you're certainly, you're not friends with a player. I mean, you don't have like a personal relationship with him. You don't go over his house. You don't go out to dinner or anything like that. But you're around him a lot, and you see the highs and lows. And he was just he was brutally honest. He would say a lot of things that I'm sure the team didn't want him to say sometimes. And when he got to know you, I think he would figure out after a while whether he could trust you or not. Whether if he said to you like, hey, I'm going to tell you something, but don't I don't want to see it in the paper. About when maybe just how he felt or what he felt about a teammate or something. He is a really smart baseball guy, and he would talk to you about a rookie and say, you watch, this guy's going to be great. And he was always right. Like he knew Mookie was good before anybody else knew Mookie was good. And there's other times everybody said, oh, this guy's like a big prospect. And they would say, yeah, I don't know, I'm not seeing it. And he would be right a lot of times. He's a really smart baseball guy. So that was the thing I really liked about him was a lot of times if I was writing something, I would just ask him his opinion about it. Even if it wasn't anything to do with him, I'd say, what do you think about, whatever, how John Lackey's making a comeback? And he would be really insightful about it and kind of give me ideas about like, hey, where could I go with this story? And I don't think David's ever going to manage. I don't think he wants to manage, but he's a really, really smart baseball guy. And I think people see him and, he's Big Papi and he's always cracking jokes and he's laughing. He's a baseball genius. And like Pedro's the same way. I mean, Pedro's unbelievable when it comes to baseball stuff. And that's, I think, the part of it that people don't see. They see what they are in the field, but like, those are two guys that, are as smart about baseball as anybody I've ever met.
I was going to ask you, it's funny if you saw a future for David Ortiz in managing, because he's got that big personality. Players love him, and I just feel like he can connect the way, almost like Alex Cora, how he can connect to his players. You said he probably doesn't want to, but I think he'd be the perfect MLB manager.
He would be really good. Well, there's two things, I guess. It's a really hard job. You get to the park at like 11 o'clock in the morning. You got to go over all of these scouting reports. You watch a lot of film. You have obligations to the media. You have obligations to sponsors. You have obligations to the owners. It's a really, long day and a hard job. Well, he's made a ton of money. He doesn't need that kind of hassle in his life. He wants to enjoy his life. And the other part of it is, when you guys think about it, there's not a lot of really good players who become managers. A lot of the managers are guys who are kind of mediocre players. And Alex is a good example of that. He was a pretty good player, but he wasn't a great player. I think it's hard for really good players to be managers or coaches because it's hard for like in David's instance, you can't go up to a guy and say, all right, well, listen, when it's a 4-4 game in the 8th inning and we really, just sit back on that fastball and wait and then crush it to right field. And the guy can be like, well, I don't know how to do that. And David would be like, well, no, it's easy. Just, watch me, and like, I remember when I was covering the Mets, like when Mike Piazza was getting ready to retire, they were like, oh, you'd be a great hitting coach. And Mike kind of laughed at that because, like, well, no, not really. I mean, Mike had some of the best opposite field power in the history of baseball. Like, you can't teach a guy how to have opposite field power. Like, Pedro's really good talking about pitching, but like, you can't teach anybody how to be Pedro Martinez. So I think for really good players, it's hard because they just had this tremendous ability, and it's hard to convince how do you kind of bring that forward to another player. I think, but where Alex understands what it's like to struggle, and he can take a guy aside who's struggled and say, hey man, here's how you get out of this slump. I mean, I think that would be hard for Pedro to like say like, oh yeah, here's how you get out of a slump. Not that I know anything about it because I was always awesome. Like, it's kind of I think it's just harder for the good player.
Do you think that's because, and this isn't a knock on Alex Cora or anything, but because they're so smart, they have such brilliant baseball minds, and because of a lot of like what Ortiz did, Piazza and Pedro, you can't really teach. It's who they are, and that's just what they've done.
Some of it's like that, and there's also a skill involved in teaching. Alex was on TV for a while before he became a manager. He's a really good communicator, and Alex is a guy. When you think about Alex, so he's from Puerto Rico, so he understands what it's like to be a Latin American player. He went to the University of Miami, so he understands what it's like to be a college player who gets drafted. He was an everyday player for the Dodgers, so he understands what it's like to be an everyday player. He was a guy who's been released and traded and been a part-time player, so he understands that. He can talk to somebody in that. He's a guy who was involved in a scandal, and he came back from that. He's a guy was married and got divorced. He's a guy who's now has another significant other, and he's got children with her. So there's not really one guy in the Red Sox clubhouse who can come in to see Alex, and Alex can go, I can't understand, I don't have any frame of reference with you. He has a frame of reference with everybody. And a guy like David, he struggled early in his career, but he's been this, huger than life, successful personality for a long time. I think it would be hard for David to understand what it would be like for a guy who's been traded and released 5 times and is trying to make the team, because he doesn't really get that. But that's what makes, I think, Aaron Boone is the same way. I think that's why Alex is a great manager. I think that's why David Ross is going to be a great manager. Those guys understand what it's like to be on both sides of it. And the communication aspect of it is really good. So like David, with David, when he communicated, people listened to him because he was David. He didn't have to necessarily listen to you. He would just tell you what he thought. So I think David would be a great mentor for a young player, but I don't know that he would have the patience to try to be a manager.
I could also never see him not in a Red Sox uniform or a Red Sox hat. I think what him and Pedro do right now for the Red Sox, just being those supportive players that come to spring training and like you said, mentor players, I think that's the perfect position for them. But the last thing that I just wanted to ask you about was, it came out today, an interview with Ken Rosenthal, that Dustin Pedroia said, if he was a voter, he wouldn't have voted for Manny Ramirez because, there's rules. And obviously, especially with what happened with Bonds and Clemens and, what the mindset is right now on steroid players. From that standpoint, do you think that there's any chance that A-Rod or Manny Ramirez gets into the Hall of Fame during these next 10 years?
Yeah, I'll never vote for him. When I looked at it, I looked at it like, okay, well, there was no testing, and then there was testing. And when they put in testing, and I was covering baseball when they put in testing, everybody understood, okay, it's over. There's not going to be any, if you do something now, you're going to pay it. You're going to lose money. You're going to be out of a certain number of games. Your team is going to be shortchanged. You can't do it. And Manny went ahead and did it. He did it a couple times. A-Rod went ahead and did it a couple times. And everybody knew the consequences. Robbie Cano understands he's never going to get in the Hall of Fame. Maybe A-Rod's going to try to sweet talk his way in, and he's a different kind of guy. Manny's never really. I don't even think he's gotten beyond 30% in the voting. I think he has 4 more years left. He's never going to get there. I think it's going to be a hard road for Alex too. And I just think, a lot of people would say to me like, well, you can't vote for the cheaters. And I would say, okay, great. Hand me the list of everybody 100% sure cheated. And then hand me another list of everybody 100% who didn't cheat. And I'll vote that way. But until 2004, when they put the testing in, you had no way of knowing. And I wouldn't bet a nickel on anybody before then being clean. Not anybody. I mean, there's guys who I can't imagine did anything, but I wouldn't put a nickel on it. But after that, you kind of have a pretty good eye. I mean, I saw David get pulled in the test, I don't know, probably 50 times in my career. I mean, he was getting tested all the time. So I think that's the way I've tried to look at it. I think a lot of voters look at it that way. And so it's going to be a really, Manny's never getting in, and it's going to be a really hard road for Alex. And I think if you're a guy like Dustin, who came in after they started, right around the time they started testing and played his whole career being tested, it's going to be frustrating to see what happened with Manny, because you were playing under the same rules and you abided by those rules. And then this guy decided, well, no, I'm not going to do it. So I can understand. The way Dustin feels is the way a lot of players feel. That's been my experience.
Do you think someone like A-Rod, who was suspended, and Manny was too, but all of what A-Rod accomplished, do you think people may look at him and be like, well, he served his time, so maybe he does deserve a vote? I know you're not going to vote that way, and I would do the same thing, but sometimes I feel like do the time, do the crime kind of thing.
Maybe. I mean, maybe. And, he's gonna try. I mean, he'll be on TV and he'll be doing these different things. And, he's obviously kind of needy when it comes to attention. So he's always, Manny has disappeared, right? You see Manny on Instagram every now and again. He looks like he's a desert island survivor or whatever. But I mean, A-Rod is everywhere, right? It's hard to, A-Rod was at the freaking Packers game the other day. So I mean, It's hard to, you can't miss him. And so, maybe there'll be enough people as voters get younger and they remember the good A-Rod. They'll go, oh yeah, okay, I'll vote for A-Rod, whatever. But I don't know. I mean, to me, he knew what he was getting into. He did it a couple times. I mean, there was at one point the Yankees wouldn't let him come to the stadium because he was suing the Yankees. I mean, that's how bad it was. So I don't know. I don't see that. I think there's going to be a lot of writers who are going to say, hey, this is where it stops. But I don't know. The guy has come back from being a pariah to being on Sunday Night Baseball. So I guess he's capable of anything. So who knows? But it's I don't know. Alex is what's frustrating to me about, I covered Alex because with the Yankees. He is fundamentally the best baseball player I've ever seen. He does everything right. He never got thrown out trying to stretch for another base. He never threw to the wrong base. He never did anything stupid on the field. He was a great player. And you almost want to go up to him and go, why did you do this? You're such a good player. You have every advantage in the world. You're tall and you're strong and you're fast. You have great hand-eye coordination. You're fundamentally brilliant. And yet you still did this. You're such a dope. Why did you do this? And, I don't know. I don't get it. He would have been a probably unanimous Hall of Famer if he hadn't done this. That's how good he was. I mean, he was one of the best players in baseball when he was 18. I mean, forget about, Mike Trout and Ohtani. I mean, Alex was that kind of guy. And he crapped it all away. I mean, it's a terrible thing. I mean, not a terrible thing, but it's stupid what he did. And that's why I'll never vote for him. So.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw lastly the video that was circulating on Twitter where David Ortiz beat Ken Griffey Jr. and Alex Rodriguez when he was in the minors in a home run derby.
The home run contest. Yeah, the famous home run contest. Yeah. Yeah, I think a little bit of that has been it's a bit played up. I don't know if it's quite as dramatic as everybody talks about it then. Depending on who you ask, it becomes this fantastic story, there's thunder and lightning and David came up and, I don't know if it was quite that dramatic, but it's kind of interesting that those guys are all in the same organization at the same time. Because, imagine if they had all ever played together, that would have been, incredible. But it's, David, you hear a lot of stories about young David and, he was a player to be named later in a trade, which is incredible, right? I can't imagine there's too many Hall of Famers who were once the player to be named later. I mean, that's, it's kind of amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think if the Mariners had all them all on one team, they probably would have won 120 games or something. I
mean, it's incredible to think about,
Exactly. Well, Peter, I really appreciate you taking the time to not only give your insight, but your thoughts on the Hall of Fame tonight.
Can I give you one good baseball story?
Absolutely.
All right. You guys see this?
Yes.
All right. So it's a Dunkin' Donuts box, and it's signed by Mike Mussina.
Oh.
So here's why. So when I was covering the Yankees, Mike Mussina, in his last year, everybody knew he was going to retire. And it was Joe Girardi's first year as manager. So Joe Girardi decided that the players couldn't have junk food. He was going to ban junk food from the clubhouse. And it drove Mike crazy because he liked having junk food. And Mike is like a 36-year-old guy who's been in baseball a long time. So the last game he was pitching was at Fenway Park, the last game of the regular season. He had a chance to win 20 games. So me and a couple of the other writers, as a goof, went to Dunkin' and bought Mike a dozen donuts and had him delivered to the clubhouse, just kind of like kind of a funny thing. Like, you get your junk food. So he pitches in the game, and he pitched great. And he had a lead. He was going to win his 20th game. Mariano came in to close. The Yankees weren't going to the playoffs, but it was kind of a cool thing because Moose, won his 20th game. So during the game, a clubhouse guy comes up with this envelope and hands it to one of my buddies, one of my fellow writers. And Moose had ripped all the Dunkin' Donut box apart and signed the flaps. And so it says, "Thanks, Mike Mussina." So I was like, "Oh, this is pretty funny." So I bought it home, and I'm like, "What do I do with like a Dunkin' Donuts flap that's signed by Mike Mussina?" So I was like, "Well, I should keep it because he might get in the Hall of Fame someday." So yeah. I think I've moved like 3 times since I got that, but I always kept it. I had it in a little folder, and he made the Hall of Fame, so I framed it and I put it on my wall because I never asked for his autograph, but I got his autograph, and it's a Hall of Famer. So there you go. So that's awesome. My only Hall of Famer autograph that I have.
I love that story. Like that's I'm going to be like thinking about that for the rest of my life. That is amazing.
Yeah, it was Mike was an interesting cat. He was but yeah, so inexplicably I have a Dunkin' Donuts box signed by Mike. So
that's awesome. I love it. Really appreciate the time tonight, Peter.
Yeah, it was good talking to you guys.
I hope you guys did enjoy our conversation with Peter Abraham and was able to get a little bit of insight like we were about what his mindset was going into the Hall of Fame voting. Now, I just want to thank you guys so much for all the support throughout this offseason, throughout this lockout. As you guys have been seeing, we've been doing our best to come up with some great content ideas and bring on some great guests, but we've really appreciated all the support. And we also appreciate you making Locked On Red Sox your first listen every single day. Now make your second listen Locked On Bets, your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q, with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It's free and available on all platforms. And also make sure to follow Locked On Red Sox on Twitter because we try to get you guys involved in every single episode by making this podcast the most fan-engaging Red Sox podcast that there is out there. So we post Red Sox content on Twitter every single day, as well as ask you guys what you guys want us to talk about and what questions you want us to ask during every single episode, whether we have a guest or whether Lauren and I are just talking about the Sox. But also make sure you follow myself on Twitter. It's at Jake Iggy, as well as my co-host Lauren Campbell. It's La. That's 3 laws, Lauren with 4 R's. So we greatly appreciate all the support. Get ready for another week filled with some great guests. We're going to be having on-air host and former host of Nesson After Hours, Emerson Latzia, next week, as well as former Red Sox player Shea Hillebrand on the podcast next week. So make sure to tune into those, and I hope everybody has a great and fun, relaxing weekend. See you guys later. Peace.